to say about me. I love to sing and I love women.
In 1995, when Dean Martin was 78, love no longer felt like something ahead of him. It felt like something behind him. He had lived through devotion and distance, through marriages that ended quietly, through friendships that faded without a final conversation. Time didn't erase those experiences, it clarified them. Dean understood that not every love becomes a home. Some become lessons. Some become absences you learn to live around. What stayed with him, late in life, wasn't conquest or applause. It was admiration for women who carried grace under pressure, who survived attention, who bore loss without becoming small. There were 6 women he remembered and admired most, not with longing, but with honesty, and one of them left the world far too early. Number 1. Shirley MacLaine. Shirley MacLaine was never someone Dean Martin tried to impress. That mattered. In a town built on charm and performance, Shirley moved differently. She spoke plainly. She asked uncomfortable questions. She didn't soften her edges to make rooms easier. Dean noticed that right away, not as a challenge, but as a relief. They crossed paths in the same Hollywood corridors, where confidence was often mistaken for noise. Shirley didn't compete for space. She occupied it, and Dean, who understood performance better than most, respected anyone who didn't confuse volume with strength. What he admired wasn't her success, though she had plenty of it, or even her independence, which Hollywood liked to celebrate from a distance. It was her steadiness, the way she trusted her own thinking when it would have been easier to defer, the way she remained curious instead of defensive. Dean once hinted that Shirley reminded him of a truth many men learned too late. Real confidence doesn't need approval. It doesn't chase agreement. It simply stands. There was no romance between them, and that was part of the admiration. Dean believed some connections were meant to stay unblurred, clear, untouched by expectation. Shirley was one of those people. In later years, when Dean spoke less and listened more, he mentioned her with a quiet kind of respect, the kind reserved for people who survived the same system without letting it rename them. Not every meaningful presence asks for your heart. Some ask only for your respect. For Dean Martin, Shirley MacLaine was proof that admiration could exist without desire and still last just as long. Number 2. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was already an icon by the time Dean Martin truly noticed her. And that, in a way, was the problem. Everyone saw the image. Dean saw the effort behind it. He admired Marilyn not for the magnetism that filled rooms, but for the vulnerability she carried so carefully beneath it. On sets and at gatherings, Dean noticed how attentive she was, how she listened longer than she spoke, how praise made her uncomfortable, how criticism stayed with her longer than it should have. Marilyn worked harder than people believed. She prepared. She worried. She second-guessed herself in ways Dean recognized from his own quieter moments. Fame came easily to her, but ease did not. What stayed with him most was her gentleness. In an industry that rewarded toughness and punished sensitivity, Marilyn remained open. That openness cost her. Dean knew it. He didn't romanticize it. He once suggested that Marilyn wasn't fragile. She was unguarded. And there is a difference. Fragility breaks. Unguardedness simply absorbs more than it should. They shared laughter, brief moments of comfort, the kind that exists between people who understand the loneliness behind applause. Dean never claimed to know her deeply, but he understood enough to respect the weight she carried. In later years, when her name came up, Dean's tone always softened, not out of nostalgia, but recognition. Marilyn represented something Hollywood rarely protected: sincerity without armor. Some people shine because they're strong, others shine because they never learned how to harden. For Dean Martin, Marilyn Monroe remained unforgettable, not because she was adored by millions, but because she felt everything those millions never saw. Number 3. Angie Dickinson. Angie Dickinson represented something Dean Martin understood instinctively: poise without performance. She didn't enter rooms demanding attention. She didn't need to. There was a calm assurance about her, a steadiness that came from knowing who she was before the industry tried to define her. Dean admired that immediately. It reminded him of a time before Hollywood learned to exaggerate everything. They shared an ease that never needed explanation. Conversations flowed without effort. Silence didn't feel awkward. Dean valued that more than cleverness. He believed comfort was rarer than chemistry, and far more honest. What he admired most about Angie was her balance. She managed to be glamorous without being distant, warm without being exposed. In an era when women were often pushed toward extremes, the siren or the saint, Angie lived comfortably in the space between. She worked steadily, professionally, without feeding the machinery of scandal. Dean noticed how she protected her private life, how she understood that mystery wasn't something to manufacture. It was something to preserve. That restraint resonated with him deeply, especially as he aged. There was admiration, yes, but also recognition. Angie understood the cost of being visible. She knew how easily a public image could eclipse a real self. Dean respected anyone who guarded that line. In later reflections, he spoke of her with a quiet fondness. Not nostalgia, not regret, something calmer. Gratitude, perhaps, for having known someone who moved through the same demanding world without letting it harden her. Some people don't dazzle you, they steady you. For Dean Martin, Angie Dickinson embodied a kind of grace that didn't announce itself and didn't fade with time. Number 4. Kim Novak. Kim Novak fascinated Dean Martin because she never seemed fully convinced by Hollywood's version of success. There was a distance about Kim, not coldness, but separation. She stood slightly apart from the machinery even while standing inside it. Dean admired that instinctively. He understood what it meant to play a role convincingly, while never mistaking it for real life. Kim carried beauty in a way that felt almost accidental, as if she hadn't asked for it and wasn't entirely sure what to do with it once it arrived. Dean noticed how that made people uneasy. Hollywood prefers certainty. Kim offered complexity. What he admired most was her resistance. She questioned scripts. She challenged expectations. When the industry tried to mold her into something simpler, more obedient, she pushed back, sometimes at great cost to her career. Dean knew how rare that was. He sensed in Kim a quiet refusal to be consumed. Fame never seemed to settle comfortably on her shoulders. Rather than letting it define her, she kept parts of herself untouched. Dean respected that boundary. He believed survival often depended on what you refused to surrender. As he grew older, Dean spoke of Kim not as a star, but as someone who understood the danger of being endlessly watched. She represented a choice he admired deeply, the choice to protect one's inner life, even if it meant stepping back. Sometimes strength looks like staying. Sometimes it looks like leaving. For Dean Martin, Kim Novak embodied a rare kind of wisdom, knowing when admiration from the world costs too much and choosing yourself instead. Number 5. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor lived at a volume most people never approach. And yet, that wasn't what Dean Martin admired most. What stayed with him was her endurance. Elizabeth loved boldly, publicly, sometimes recklessly, and then lived with the consequences just as openly. Dean understood that kind of courage. He knew how unforgiving the world could be toward people who felt deeply and refused to hide it. She wasn't careful with her heart. She was honest with it. That honesty cost her. Marriages became headlines. Mistakes became mythology. But Elizabeth never pretended she hadn't lived them. Dean admired that refusal to rewrite her own story for comfort. Behind the glamour, he noticed her loyalty. Once Elizabeth let someone into her life, she stayed present, protective, invested, unwavering. Dean saw how seriously she took connection, even when it hurt. He also respected her strength in later years, when illness and loss reshaped her public image. Elizabeth didn't retreat. She adapted. She found purpose beyond the screen. Dean believed that kind of evolution was the truest measure of a life fully lived. Some lives aren't meant to be neat. They're meant to be honest. For Dean Martin, Elizabeth Taylor represented the bravery of loving out loud and continuing forward, even when the echoes never quite fade. Number 6. Sharon Tate. Sharon Tate stayed with Dean Martin for a reason that had nothing to do with time, and everything to do with its absence. She carried lightness without naivete. She laughed easily, but she wasn't careless. She dreamed openly, but she wasn't unaware of the world she was stepping into. Dean admired that balance. She was young when they crossed paths, younger than most people who moved confidently through Hollywood rooms. And yet, she listened more than she spoke. She noticed people. She treated attention as something to be shared, not claimed. What struck him most was her optimism, the quiet belief that life was still expanding, not closing in. At 78, that quality felt almost foreign to him. Her death shook the industry not because a star was lost, but because a future was erased. Possibility ended mid-sentence. When Dean remembered Sharon late in life, it wasn't with sorrow alone. It was with a gentler ache, the awareness that some people are remembered not for what they became, but for what they never had the chance to be. Some lives end before they harden. For Dean Martin, Sharon Tate represented the most painful truth of all, that time is uneven, and grace is not always given the chance to age. What he chose to remember. By the time Dean Martin looked back on his life, admiration mattered more than romance. Admiration endured. It stayed honest. These 6 women represented different kinds of strength: independence, vulnerability, restraint, courage, intensity, innocence. None of them were perfect. None of them needed to be. Dean understood that love can end, fame can fade, and regret can soften with time. But respect, real respect, lasts. If you value stories told with care, honesty, and respect for the lives behind the legends, stay with us. Some stories deserve to be remembered slowly.